Well, here we are. We've made it to week 32 of our second year of our journey through the Word. This week, we will continue to listen to Solomon as he teaches us regarding wisdom and how to walk in wisdom. At the beginning of our week, Solomon has much to say about marriage and infidelity and about the adulteress. It's interesting to see how he compares the adulteress with wisdom. And he says that the adulteress sneaks through the darkened streets at twilight. Twilight is that time of day where it's the hardest to focus and to discern because of that kind of light. Where he says, wisdom, on the other hand, she lifts her voice from the mountaintops. She lifts her voice from beside the way and where the paths meet and beside the gates and at the entrance of the doors. If you stop and if we were to look at each of these places and do a study on each of these places, what we will see is that these places speak of places where you are making decisions. At the gate, this is where decisions were made. This is where courts were held. At the entrance of a door, do you go in? Do you go out? Where two roads meet. Do I go this way? Do I go this way? And so all these places are where decisions are made. And it says that wisdom stands in these places to give you the right choices so that you're making good choices that will be successful. And he says that clearly the way of the adulteress will lead you to death. God said of Israel that he considered her following after other gods as adultery. And we find that even in our New Testament, you might say, well, I'm not an adulteress and I have no plans to be an adulteress. But I want you to listen to Colossians 3, verse 5. It says, therefore, consider the members of your earthly body as dead to immorality, impurity, passion, evil desire, and greed, which is idolatry. God looked at Israel and he saw her idolatry as adultery. And now we're seeing under our new covenant that God says when we become greedy or we have wrong passions or impurity or evil desires, he says, as far as I'm concerned, this also is idolatry. So these words concerning the adulteress have a much broader message than what just seems to lay on the surface. And you may want to take some time to consider these words, because the way of the adulteress leads to death, while the way of wisdom leads to life. Last week, we looked at the 5 levels of a fool, and we saw that these levels are incorporated throughout the whole book of Proverbs. But there's something else that's also infused throughout Solomon's writings, and this is the place of wisdom. I want you to listen again to Proverbs 9, verse 1. It says, wisdom has built her house. She has hewn out her 7 pillars. So wisdom has a place where she dwells, and her dwelling place is upheld by 7 pillars. As we look at these 7 pillars, we're going to find that these 7 pillars are definitely infused and scattered throughout the book of Proverbs. You're going to see them over and over and over. So what are wisdom's 7 pillars? As we look at this illustration, we see that this is a dwelling place, and it's supported by 7 pillars. We see that there are 4 pillars at each of the corners. There are support pillars down each of the side, and you have one main paramount pillar in the center of the building. This reminds me of the story of Samson. You may remember in Samson's last day when he was held a prisoner and they'd plucked out his eyes and they'd cut off his hair to take his strength away. Now Samson's hair is grown out, and all the Philistines and the heads of the Philistines have gathered together in this main building, and they bring Samson in to make sport of him. And Samson says to the young boy that's led him in there, he says, could you just take me to the center where the center beams are? And we know that the boy took him there, and Samson put his hands on the pillars, those center beams, and he pushed them out, dislodged them, and it brought the whole building down. And so as we look at this building where there are 7 pillars, we see the 6 down each side, and then we see the center beam. This reminds me of something else. It reminds me of the lampstand, where the lampstand has a shaft, and then it has 3 branches that branch off on each side. So what are these 7 pillars? As we look at Proverbs chapter 8, they are itemized in chapter 8. And as we look at each of these pillars, we find that they correspond perfectly to the picture that's in Isaiah 11, verses 1 and 2, of the 7-fold Spirit of God. And that the Isaiah chapter 11, verses 1 and 2, as we look at that, it's a perfect illustration of the lampstand that was in the tabernacle. And so we see these parallel images. So what are the 7 pillars? So glad you asked. As we look at the lampstand, we notice that in the lampstand that it is made of a shaft from which 3 branches on each side come out. And again, even as we look at this diagram of the dwelling place of wisdom, we see that there is a middle pillar, the paramount pillar. So what is this pillar? I truly believe that this pillar is the fear of the Lord. In Psalm 11:10, and also in Proverbs 9, verse 10, it tells us that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. So we see that this main pillar in the center, from which all will come out, this main pillar is the fear of the Lord. You pull out the fear of the Lord, the wisdom will fall like a deck of cards. It has to have that main paramount pillar in the center, the fear of the Lord. Now, I know that some will say that the fear of the Lord, it doesn't really have fear, and that it's the reverential fear of the Lord. Now, I want you to listen, the reverential fear of the Lord. If we study out this word for fear, you can't take the word fear out of it, because it's fear that causes it to be separated from adoration. To adore something is one thing, but to have awe of it is something else. We have so ruined the word awe and use it for things like, oh, well, that's awesome. Well, if it doesn't cause fear, then it's not awesome. You say, but I'm not to be afraid of God. There's a certain fear we are to have of God. It's not the kind of fear that you get from something that's evil. This kind of fear is an overwhelming response to something that has such magnitude and such grandeur that it makes you to go, oh, wow. If you, again, I think I've spoken of this before, but I can't think of anything better to describe it that I have personally seen. If you've ever gone to the Grand Canyon and stood at the rim and looked down and said, oh my goodness, or gone to Niagara Falls and felt the power of the falls. These are things that, although they're beautiful and you want to go see them and you want to come near, you also know that, wow, this causes me to be cautious and it takes my breath away. And yet it causes me to desire to come near. That's the kind of fear we're to have of God. Not the fear that he thinks he's going to be angry with me and he's going to destroy me. No, it's that fear that this God is of such greatness, grandeur, magnitude. I know that he is holy. He is just. He's all these things. If we look at God and treat God as an equal or as my buddy, then our understanding of who God is askew, and we need a greater revelation of who God is. Paul writes about this dual nature of God, his kindness, as well as his severity. In Romans 11, verse 22, Paul says this: "Behold the kindness and the severity of God. To those who fell, severity, but to you, God's kindness, if you continue in his kindness. Otherwise, you also will be cut off." And so Paul clearly tells us that there are two sides of God. If you know him and walk with him, you will know his kindness and you will know his tenderness. But if not, there is this other side that you need to know. This is what God will do. The same God who is the loving, kind God is the same God who also is a God of wrath and justice and righteousness. The kindness and the severity of God. When Jehoshaphat was bringing forth the reforms in Israel, he called the judges together and he warned them concerning these things. In 2 Chronicles 19:7, he says to them, "Now then, let the fear of the Lord be upon you. Be very careful what you do, for the Lord our God will have no part in unrighteousness or partiality or the taking of a bribe." And so the first and foremost pillar is that pillar of the fear of the Lord. That brings us to the second pillar. The second pillar is knowledge. In Proverbs 1:7, we read, "The fear of Yahweh is the beginning of knowledge." And so we see that the fear of the Lord is what knowledge must be related to, and where knowledge must come from. So what is knowledge? We find that knowledge are facts, information, skills. And if we look up the definition, we find it's the theoretical or practical understanding of a subject. And so we find that knowledge without the fear of God will bring about death and destruction. This understanding takes us clear back to Genesis and back into the Garden of Eden, where God tells them, don't eat of that tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And their partaking of that tree of knowledge of good and evil brought about death and sin. Why? Because the knowledge they partook of went against God's word and against his desires and his will. And so our knowledge, the knowledge we partake of, we need to be very careful that we submit our knowledge to God's knowledge and that we have wisdom that comes from his word and from his ways. The third pillar is understanding or insight. Proverbs 14:33 tells us, wisdom rests in the heart of the one who has understanding. Several years ago, quite a number of years ago, I had a real illustration of this verse in my life. Some of you may remember the story of the closet door. And it was a situation that had brought me frustration and aggravation for a considerable length of time until I finally sat down and said, God, I don't understand. I just don't understand. And when God brought the understanding of the situation, he also dropped in my heart the wisdom of how to deal with that. So rather than tell the whole story, which would take up a considerable amount of time, and we've got a lot to cover today, I have put that story called The Closet Door, and the written story is in the description box below if you want to take some time to read the story. It's kind of a fun story. I think you might appreciate the lesson that I learned from it and perhaps incorporate that desire for understanding so that you can operate with wisdom. So it's there in the description below. That brings us to the fourth pillar. The fourth pillar is called prudence. Prudence is a form of wisdom, but prudence has a nuance to it that isn't in the word wisdom. And if we look at the word prudence, it means to take all the information and to look at it carefully, weighing out the pros and the cons, and then prudently making a decision. It also has the idea of being clever. In the Hebrew word, it's the idea of being clever or shrewd, prudence. So it's not just having a wise decision, it's coming to a decision that has a cleverness to it. I experienced this when we were buying our second house here in the valley. Greg and I had found the lot that we wanted the house to be built on. We had determined which house we wanted and also the builder, but the builder would not come into contract with us because we hadn't sold our current house and they wouldn't do a contingency. And so I went home that day and I said, God, I know that this is the house that you have for us. I know this is the piece of ground that you have for us. I know this is the builder you want to build that house. But what do I do? Because we're at an impasse. We can't begin the negotiations and we don't want to lose the plot of ground. And so what do we do? Because the builder won't move. And I said, God, could you give me the wisdom? Because I don't know what to do. And as I prayed about it, there was a plan that came into my mind. And I thought, wait a minute, if we did this, this, and this, then the builder can't lose. And yet we are guaranteed this plot of ground and we can move on. So I went to the builder the next day and I said, here is a plan that I'd like to submit to you. Now, this was a builder and they were also lenders, and they as I laid out the plan before them, they looked at it and said, oh, well, yeah, if we did that, we're guaranteed that we will get our money, and you're also guaranteed that you will get the plot of ground that you want, and we can begin to move on with the building process. I don't work in the housing industry. I didn't have the knowledge of, oh, well, we could do this or that. But with that knowledge came prudence that I didn't have. It was cunning, it was clever, and it was something that even the builder hadn't thought about. But because of the cleverness of the plan, they were willing to work with us. So prudence goes beyond just natural thinking. It has a cleverness to it that goes beyond natural thinking. And so that brings us to the fifth pillar. The fifth pillar is translated as discretion. Unfortunately, I feel that this word falls far short of the true meaning of this word. If we look in a Bible dictionary, we find that it says that it's knowledge of design, purpose, and plan. We also find that many other places in the word, it's translated as thoughts, purpose, plan, schemes, to devise a plot. And so we find that this word is actually the ability to make a plan, to have a scheme, to now incorporate these thoughts. Okay, to have thoughts is one thing, to have knowledge, to even have wisdom. But now, how do we cause these plans to come into action? And so we see that this word is the word that says now we have the knowledge, the design, the purpose, the plan to begin to bring this into being. That brings us to the sixth pillar. The sixth pillar is counsel. What is counsel? It means to have advice given it in order to solve a problem or to resolve a situation, or to go ahead with a plan. You see, it's one thing to have a plan, and it says there's wisdom in many counselors. It's a good thing if, for instance, a king going to war. It's a good thing for a king to bring in his counselors and to say, okay, this is what I'm planning on doing, and to put the plan before his counselors so that they can say, well, we need to incorporate this, or we need to be careful of this, so that the system of checks and balances can bring forth the best result. Iron sharpens iron. And so God says counsel is also a part of wisdom's plans, and it's one of her pillars. And that brings us now to the seventh pillar. The seventh pillar is the pillar called power. We see it in chapter 8, Proverbs 8. The word is amud, or power. The same word is translated in Isaiah 11 as strength. It's the exact same word, translated in this word as power, translated in this scripture as strength. As we dig into this word, we find that it's this word that's given to a warrior who has the strength to prevail. And so one of the pillars of wisdom is that when we have all these other things, that it gives us the strength we need to prevail in whatever it is that we're doing. It's these words that are liberally scattered throughout all of the Proverbs. We find that God's wisdom brings success on all levels of our life, and this is clearly reflected throughout all of Solomon's words. Is it any wonder that more than once Solomon tells us it is much better to get wisdom than it is to get gold? I trust that your journey this week will result in discovering much gold, and you will find that at the end of this week, your life has been truly enriched. May you increase in understanding. May prudence become your mode of operation, and may you find God's thoughts in your decision making, in the process of making plans, in the way you order your home, and in the way you govern your life. And may you increase in strength so that you will prevail in all that you endeavor to do. I pray you enjoy your week. And once again, I will see you again next week.